Hello. So today we are getting into chapter 13. So we talked a little bit about last week about the blood, components of the blood, what is in the blood, the purpose of the blood. So now we're going to get into the heart, and then we'll get into chapter 14 and talk about its vessels and the arteries and the veins and all of that. So um, it's actually a pretty cool organ. It's super interesting, like how methodically it works and how everything works. So let's get into the heart. So our heart beats about 100,000 times a day. If you divide that by seconds or minutes, you should get about 65, I believe, per minute. 35 million times a year. That's crazy. That's a lot. So it just keeps pumping. Imagine if I had to remind myself to tell my heart to pump. That'd be pretty bad. I always forget stuff. It propels blood through approximately 100,000 kilometers of vessels all across our body, all over. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty cool. 60,000 miles, and it pumps about 5 liters of blood per minute. So the study of the heart, or if you study the heart, you're gonna get into cardiology. Okay, cardiologist, specialist in the heart. All right, so I got my book here on the side. Make sure I don't forget anything. Okay, so we have the heart location. So it's a little hollow. It is a cone shaped, about the size of a closed fist. So hopefully you have your pig heart, which we'll dissect after this. Um, but I think it's important that you get a lot of the structure so you can then open it up and look at different things. It lies in the mediastinum. 2/3 of it is to the left of the midline. So you can draw a midline and you go a little bit to the left of it, and you should see 2/3 of it will be to the left of it. 1/3 of it will be to the right of it. You have its apex area and its base area. And it's pretty cool because the heart is like kind of like spiral. If you look at it from the bottom up, it kind of like spirals up. The blood flow kind of goes that way. But also that's how it really was. It really was created when it was a little embryo. It was just a little channel, but as it kept growing like upwards. So if you have the heart, say it's fist, you look from the bottom part, you're able to see kind of like a little spiral. We'll probably get into that later on. But so here's like a transverse cut of the body, just chopped off. Now that it's Halloween, you can look at these pictures. But basically, you have here our vertebral column in the back. We have our aorta coming through the top, the little esophagus. Okay, here's a heart right here in the front. Pericardial cavity, so a little cavity surrounding the heart or around the heart. Here's our sternum in the top front. And we got our lungs as well. So we got blood with no oxygen coming through the heart going into the lungs, and then blood with oxygen coming from the lungs going into the heart. Okay. So here's another picture. You can see if you draw the midline right through the middle, you should get 2/3 of it to the left side of it and 1/3 of it to the right. Okay. We got the apex of the heart, which would be right here at the bottom. It's kind of that little curve that you see cone ending at the bottom. Okay, the right surface, the left surface. Remember, looking at the person itself, not you looking at it, but you itself, your right and your left. An inferior surface on the bottom. And here's our lungs. Pulmonary trunk, which we'll get into. Aortic arch, which we'll get into as well. Vena cava coming from the right side. Okay, so here's more of a real anatomy kind of picture of our heart. The pulmonary trunk, the lungs kind of surrounding it, covering it. Heart inside the pericardial, or a sac that's surrounding the heart or around the heart. Apex of the heart, kind of at the bottom. All right. So here's our midline position. So you have a midline, and you can draw a mid-clavicular. So if you look at the clavicle, kind of like the end of the clavicle, you can draw a line downwards as well. And that would be your mid-clavicular line, and it's in between the mid-clavicular and the midline. Okay. The surface projection is the outline shaped of an organ on the surface of the body. Has its anterior surface, its inferior surface, its right surface, or its left surface. Okay, so just kind of looking at the heart and the different locations of it. Okay, it has a pericardium, so that's surrounding tissue around the heart. Okay, and it has the epicardium, the myocardium, the endocardium. So we got the little pericardium that's surrounding the heart, and there's fibrilous, or like fibers. So we got these fibers that are in there, and then there's a serous kind of like liquid pericardial membrane as well, and we have the pericardial cavity, or the cavity around the heart. Remember, peri around, cardium, heart. So break up your root words, and you should kind of get where it is. Um, and those layers in that pericardium, we have the epicardium, myo, which would be muscle, and the endocardium, which is kind of more on the inside part. So here's a little image. Um, so we have here on the right, but I think the one on the left kind of will help us a little more. So you have our heart, and then here's our pericardium, and you can see the endocardium would be kind of more on the inside, a little inside layer. The myocardium would be all that muscle that's going around. Myocardium, as you can see here on the right as well, it's a thicker muscle of it. That's the myocardium. That's all muscle. Obviously, if our heart's going to be pumping and pumping and pumping, we need some muscle to pump the blood in or out. Right. Endocardium on the inside again. Right. Epicardium kind of just surrounding kind of the edge on the outside. Okay. Cardiac muscle. So the muscle, basically the muscle around the heart, so the muscle that makes up the heart, has these intercalated discs. We didn't get into a lot of that regarding the muscle or the muscle structure, but it's basically a couple of discs that are able to kind of like move across and contract and relax and contract and relax. And then those discs will pass action potentials or signals. You got desmosomes that will kind of transfer information or nutrients or energy across, and we got some gap junctions that will communicate the muscles themselves as well. Okay, so here's a couple of pictures. Okay, so we got, these are the discs, Z discs over here, this intercalated discs, so they're kind of like this. And we got over here on the middle left, we got these little gap junctions to kind of relay information. We got a little nucleus, sarcomere of the muscle itself. Okay. Right. So now let's get into the heart itself. Right. So let's get into the chambers of the heart. So it has two superior chambers. That's where our atriums, and it has two inferior ones, which are the ventricles. It has a pulmonary pump and a systemic pump. So one that's going to be to the lungs, one that's going to be to the rest of the body, and it has our auricles. Okay, so let's get into images of it, or sorry, into the heart. A couple more info, but I want to get into the images. I feel like looking at the heart itself is gonna make more sense. Okay, three major surface markings that you're gonna see, or grooves around the heart. We have a coronary sulcus, the anterior interventricular, so between the ventricles sulcus, and the posterior interventricular, between the ventricles sulcus as well. Okay, so let's get to it right here. So we have, so this is kind of not sliced yet, so you just see the anterior whole view of it. But you can see here on the left, so remember, if you kind of flip yourself around of the heart itself, so your left is going to be, if you're looking like this, your left is your right is your left. But here's the left part, the left ventricle. We'll have our left atrium, a right ventricle, right atrium up here. Coronary sulcus that we're talking about. Okay, the anterior interventricular sulcus, so these little grooves in between the two ventricles as well. Okay, here where we have the posterior interventricular sulcus as well, on the posterior parts. Okay, so now here is looking at it straight up. The right atrium's on the right, the left atrium is on the left. Right ventricle will be this little bottom curve. Left ventricle will be this little left curve. Okay. We have a lot of stuff here coming around as well. We got aortic arch, descending aorta, brachiocephalic trunk, the carotid artery, subclavian artery. We got our superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. We have the right pulmonary artery. Okay, the right pulmonary veins, the left pulmonary veins. Right, so we got different stuff coming around. So. All right, let's get to it. So this picture, I feel like, is the one that's more more helpful. It kind of divides the chambers, the four chambers, a little more. So here's our right atrium, right ventricle. Here's our left atrium and our left ventricle. And you see this muscle around it, right? Interventricular septum is this little kind of like thickness in between the two ventricles. So these are our ventricles. So you'll see one is blue and one is red. What does that mean? What does the difference in blue and red mean? That means one is oxygen rich and one is oxygen poor. So this will make sense if you just think about it a little bit. Think about the blood going into the rest of your body and giving the oxygen to where it's supposed to go, right? So now just logic or common sense, that blood is coming back with no oxygen, right? So blood with no oxygen that's already going out, it's going to be a little darker. And it looks a little darker, so we paint it blue, or in pictures we get it blue. And that's deoxygenated blood, or blood without oxygen. So if you think about the right atrium, you think about the vena cavas, right here, the inferior, the superior. So you think of this blood that's coming in, either from the top, from the bottom, from the ears, from different areas. Blood that's coming in with no oxygen that will go from this right atrium to the right ventricle, and then it will be pumped out. So we got some valves in here in the middle. It will be pumped back to the pulmonary trunk. So pulmonary is always lungs. So if it doesn't have oxygen, it's going to come from right RA to RV, going into the lungs, right? To why is it going to the lungs? To get some more oxygen. And then it's going to come from the lungs, right, back to the left atrium and the left ventricle to the aorta and go all the way into the rest of the body, right? We have our artery over here coming from the top, brachiocephalic, carotid, subclavian arteries. Here's our aorta, ascending and descending would be through the back. So ascending going up, descending coming down, right? So the aorta is the one that's going to have this red oxygen-rich blood that's going to be transferred to the rest of the body. So it goes through the cycle again, and we'll talk about the vessels in the next video, but or capillaries and all that. Basically, the blood with oxygen will then split up, go everywhere else, and then come back through the vena cavas a little darker because the oxygen was used by the cells. Okay, so that's a way to remember. So it comes from those vena cavas, and it's blue with no oxygen, RA, RV, to the lungs, and then the lungs gets some more oxygen, comes back LA, LV, to the rest of the body, right? So that's our little cycle. That should be, you should know that cycle. Try to memorize that little cycle. Maybe in the book it has a better explanation, but there are some animations actually on Wiley where I think, and I'm gonna try to show it in class, but there's some animations where it kind of shows the pumping of the blood and the movement of the blood through animations and all that, and it's pretty cool. But you should know, and again, I think it's common sense. Just think about it logically. It's just memorizing a couple of different parts of the heart, but it's just common sense. The blood is coming with no oxygen because he gave it away. It's coming back. It's coming back through our right side, back to the right atrium, right ventricle, because it's going to go to the lungs, gets some oxygen in the lungs, and it comes back from left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, into the rest of the body. Okay, so that's pretty much how that's going to work. So we're going to get to the structures of the different ones, of the different chambers. Basically, you can see here the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And a big thing you're going to notice here is going to be the left ventricle is a lot thicker, right? It's pretty cool, right? It's pretty crazy. It's a lot thicker than our right ventricle. And why do you think that is? What do you think that is? So let's go back a little bit. We have our left ventricle thicker, right ventricle thinner, right? So left ventricle is going to be over here. Right ventricle is going to be over here. So the bottom ones, bottom left, or in the picture, it would be bottom right, bottom left. You see right ventricle. It's thinner. This one's thicker. So this one's thicker because it's pumping a lot more blood out to the body. So if it's pumping more blood out, right, it's the one that's pumping it out, it needs more muscle force. So it's going to be thicker. It's going to pump more blood out. So you need more blood to be pumped out. And then when we talked about it beating hundreds of thousands of times and liters per day and per minute, like it needs to pump a lot. So you need a lot of muscle to pump this oxygen-rich blood to the rest of your body. You need less muscle to receive that blood and just shove it into the lungs, right? It's all coming towards it. But this one, it needs to pump it out through this aorta, aortic arch. And you also see that aorta is a lot, it has a wider diameter as well, right? So that means you need to pump more blood out. So that wider diameter and more muscle, more pumping out of that blood. So that's why it kind of looks like this. All right. So start with the right atrium. Like I said, it receives that deoxygenated blood, so with no oxygen, from the three main veins. We have our superior vena cava, which is on top, inferior vena cava would be on the bottom, and the coronary sinus, which is kind of like coming across. Okay. It's got these muscles, pectinate muscles. You got this little internal ridges inside that wall. Has an interatrial septum, so that wall in between the atriums, kind of between the two. Fossa ovalis, that's like a little, like a groove inside that part of the atrium, the right atrium. And there's what's very important, which is a tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve. So we talk about atrioventricular. So how do we control the blood flow of the blood itself? We can't just have an open container and just kind of like a hose and let it go, just circle around, right? We have to control it somehow. So these valves, it's kind of like closing the water line and opening, closing it and opening it, closing it and opening. So you don't want too much blood to be accumulated in any of those chambers. So that right atrioventricular valve, the valve between the atrium and the ventricle, makes sense, the root words. So the valve between the right atrium and the ventricle is going to either close or open, close or open, close or open. It's going to let some blood in and close it so it doesn't backflow, so it doesn't come back. What if it gets full and now that blood with no oxygen is coming back, so now everything's pushed back, so now like it doesn't make sense. So we're trying to like throw a little bit into that ventricle, close it up, let the ventricle push it out to the lungs, and then open it again, get some more, close it up, push it out to the lungs, get some more, close it up, push it out to the lungs. Okay, so in the right atrium we have that tricuspid valve. So tri because there's three little lips that's going to be on that valve. So here's an image that we can see. So we're focusing here on our left blue portion of the heart. So we got our right atrium, right? Fossa ovalis is this little groove kind of like on the inside. Here's our superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and then you're going to see here's our valve, right atrioventricular valve, which is this one right here, okay, between the atrium and the ventricle. So then a little bit of blood will flow in, closes, blood pumps out to the lungs, opens up. Blood flows in, closes, blood pumps out, opens up. Okay, and then similar structure for the rest, but this one is the right atrioventricular. We're going to have the left atrioventricular as well between atrium and ventricle over here on the left side. Okay. And now we got the right atrium on top. Then we have the right ventricle, which is right underneath. Forms most of that anterior surface of the heart. So the front portion of the heart, most of it is that right ventricle. It has trabeculae carneae or chordae tendineae. Again, it's those little grooves, the little muscles inside that ventricle as well. And it has that valve has a couple of like I'm gonna say it has like little ligaments kind of coming out. So when the valve closes, like it's able to contract and then open up, contract and open up. Like the valve's not there; it's attached to a couple of those little like ligaments that are coming out. Right? It's got papillary muscles. You also have an interventricular septum. So the other one was an interatrial septum. As you can see right here, interatrial septum, of the wall between the two atriums. This is the wall between the two ventricles. Okay, and you can see it right here in the middle. Right? And these are the little kind of tendon-like structures that I was telling you about to close the valve. And we'll get into that a little later in the chapter. Okay, and we have a pulmonary valve and a pulmonary trunk as well. Okay, so here's our pulmonary trunk right on top. That's gonna receive what's gonna be like the tube for that blood to flow into the lungs, and then here's our pulmonary valve on top as well. Right, so this is gonna close. So in case when this opens, more blood fills. This closes so this blood doesn't backflow back to the heart. So if you think of gravity, you think of it being at the bottom, you pump some up, you have to close it. So in case it takes a while to get rid of that blood, it doesn't just run back down. You know what I mean? Like it closes and it leaves a little bit of blood in there to get pulled out, and then it opens, more blood comes up, close it, and then pulled out. But if it wouldn't close, then whatever didn't go out at the first contraction, it would just backflow inside, and then you have this a lot of blood in that right ventricle, and that backflow of blood coming back to the atrium. So like you'd have a mess. So that's what those valves are for. They're closing, and they're also because of that muscle movement, closing and opening to flow that blood. Okay. All right. So we got right atrium, right ventricle. Now the blood is in the lungs, and then we're gonna have the left atrium. So we got these pulmonary veins, right? Where you're gonna have these this blood is coming back into the heart. Okay, so basically, artery means away. When we talk about arteries, it's going away from the heart. When we talk about veins, it's coming into the heart. Okay, so when you get blood drawn from your veins, you're gonna see it pretty dark. I don't know if you did, cause I just got blood drawn. It's pretty dark, but that blood from your veins has no more oxygen and it's coming back to the heart, right? So we got these pulmonary veins. So veins from the lungs, and there's two left and there's two right that are coming back from the lungs into the heart again with blood that has oxygen rich, that is oxygen rich, trying to send that blood to the rest of the body. And it also has a bicuspid valve. The other one was tricuspid. This one's bicuspid, so two. It's also called the left, so we're already on the left, atrial ventricular, between the atrium and the ventricle valve. Okay. So again, splitting up those words is going to help you a lot. It helps me a lot, so that's why I emphasize it much. So here it is. So we're on the top right kind of red portion, these left pulmonary veins that are going to be coming from the lung in here, right? So if we think about, it may be a little confusing, but just thinking about vena cava or thinking about veins, why are those blue and why are those red? Doesn't mean veins are blue or veins are red. That just means the flow of blood through those veins, it's either oxygen rich or oxygen poor. So if you think about it, you're going to see red pulmonary veins. Why do you have red veins when you can have blue veins, right? Like darker colored veins. Well, yeah, but these veins are coming to the heart with oxygen rich blood, while these veins are coming to the heart with oxygen poor blood or no oxygen blood, or blood with no oxygen. Okay, makes sense. Hope it makes sense. So here's left pulmonary veins right here on the right. We got the right pulmonary veins on this side, on the left side. Basically, one lung's over here, one lung's over here, pumping blood inwards. So now you got double sources of blood coming in, and this atrium right here. And here's our bicuspid valve, or the left atrioventricular valve. Atrium, ventricle, atrioventricular, pumping blood into the aorta, ascending aorta, coming up aorta, and the aortic arch. And then the descending on the outside, and brachiocephalic trunk, left subclavian, left common carotid. Okay. And then we go into the left ventricle, which is the bottom. That's our thickest part of the heart. It also contains trabecular carneae. So again, you got a lot of those muscle ridges. You got those little tendon-like connecting to the valves, papillary muscles, and chordae tendineae. Blood passes from the left ventricle into the aorta. Okay. And then the left ventricle also has the right and left coronary arteries that are coming out. So remember, arteries go away. So we got these coronary arteries are going to take blood away from it. So some of the blood is going to go to those coronary arteries, and the rest of it will go to the arch of the aorta and descending aorta. Okay, and you also have what's called the ductus arteriosus. So here's a again, looking at this picture again, we got our left ventricle right here. Trabecular carneae, the little kind of ridges, muscles, right? Papillary muscle in here. Blood's pumping out. I don't know if there's another. I think I deleted the other picture. Cool. So we can see a little more from the backside. So here's our left pulmonary artery, right? Again, artery doesn't mean red, doesn't mean blood, or just arteries are red or arteries are blue. It's just the oxygen itself, the blood with oxygen or without oxygen is there. So our right pulmonary artery, left pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins left and right over here as well. The coronary sinus over here, the coronary sulcus, and the right coronary artery that's getting blood from that, from the LV, pumping out into the rest of the body, right? Okay. So yeah, what else? Here's an aortic arch. Here's a descending aorta. Remember, the inside part was the ascending because it's coming up. Now descending because it's coming down. Let's get back to where we were. Okay. Now, there's what's called the fibrous skeleton of the heart. So that's basically the rings in the different areas of the heart. So you have a pulmonary fibrous ring, aortic fibrous ring, right AV fibrous ring, and left AV fibrous ring. So that's basically kind of like around the valves. You got this fibrous ring kind of protecting it and able to expand and contract and kind of protecting that area. Right. So here's our pulmonary fibrous ring. Left AV fibrous ring, right AV fibrous ring, and aortic fibrous ring. Okay. So this valve is coming from the lungs, right? This valve is going to the aorta from the LV, left atrioventricular between the atrium and the ventricles on the left, right atrioventricular between the atrium and the ventricles on the right. Okay. So now, talking about those valves, there are 4 of those that prevent the backflow of the blood in the heart after the blood goes through them. Again, think about it. It's trying to get out and get into a certain area. We don't want it to come back in again. Okay, we want it to just keep flowing constantly, continuously, blood through our body. So we have the 2 atrioventriculars, right, the left and the right. They prevent that backflow of the blood from the ventricles back to the atriums. We don't want that. From atriums to ventricles, not from ventricles to atriums. We also have papillary muscles and chordae tendineae that are going to attach to those valves. Okay, and then we also have 2 semi-lunar valves, and those are going to be valves that allow the election of the blood from those ventricles either to the lungs or it's going to be to the aorta and prevent that backflow of blood back into the heart. So once it's already out, it's out. We don't want it back in. We have an entrance, we don't want it back in, right? So we have pulmonary valve and we have aortic valve, right? One going to the lungs, pulmonary, and one going to the aorta, aortic valve. Okay, so here's our valves, okay? So here's our chordae tendineae. Again, those little kind of like ridges there. Okay, so here's our left atrioventricular valve. So bicuspid, so this one's bicuspid. You can see kind of like 2 lips, right? What does it say? So here's pulmonary valves, right? Aortic valve, so it's open, and these ones, the other ones are open. So one's open to blood flow in, while the other ones take it out. The other one opens for blood flow to leave, while the other ones close it up, right? So you can see pulmonary and aortic are going to be close together, while the left and the right atrioventricular is open. So just think about that a little bit. Why are these 2 working together and these 2 working together, right? So you're going to have an inflow of blood from the lungs. So this is going to open. Blood from the lungs will come in to the atrium to the ventricle, from the atrium to the ventricle, and blood from the body or the vena cava is going to come in from the atrium to the ventricle, right? So once you have it in those ventricles, then those close, and then our ventricles are going to push it out. And that's when you got our pulmonary valve opening and our aortic valve opening. Why are those opening? Well, that's when the blood is pushing out from the ventricles either to the lungs or to the aorta. So that's why they work together, 2 and 2. So blood goes in, they close up, and then blood goes out, they open, the other ones close up. Okay. Now, the heart pumps blood into circuits, or 2 circuits, arranged kind of in series. We have what's called systemic circulation, right? So circulation of blood to the system. The left ventricle, so if you think about it, that left ventricle will pump the blood into the aorta, and then you have these branches that will get into systemic arteries and then capillaries, and then we'll get into the rest of that. And then you also have what's pulmonary circulation, right? So pulmonary circulation, you got pulmonary trunk or arteries. So pulmonary is coming away from the heart into the lungs, and then you have pulmonary capillaries, and you have pulmonary veins that are coming from the lungs into the heart. Okay? So here, this is a cool picture. So if you're gonna kind of if you're gonna memorize a process, I would suggest this is the big one that you should. Okay, so start with the numbers, and it's pretty self-explanatory, right? So you're starting here. You can either start at 10, or you can start at 1, right? At 10, the blood already did its job. It's coming back to the heart, right? So you can start at 10. Blood's coming from those vena cavas back to number 1, which was our right atrium. Okay. And then from that right atrium, it's going into the right ventricle, right? It's coming at the bottom. We have this atrioventricular valve, or the right atrioventricular valve, okay? And then the blood from there is gonna come through to the pulmonary trunk, back to the lungs, right? Left or right, um, left or right. Pulmonary arteries. So remember, artery is away. So we got these arteries that go towards the lungs, away from the heart, which are blue because the blood doesn't have oxygen. Okay, so we're number 3. Then we go to number 4. That's our lungs. Okay, so pulmonary capillaries. That blood loses that CO2, kind of gets cleaned up, gets that oxygen again, and now it goes back up. Right. So we ended at 4 with the lungs. Now we get through 5. It's coming back up through those pulmonary arteries. No, arteries go away. Pulmonary veins, which are coming back into the heart. So pulmonary veins, right? Lungs, veins from the lungs. So that means water is coming from the lungs into the heart, right? Pulmonary arteries are arteries towards the lungs, okay? So don't get those confused and try to get those terms and they'll help you out memorizing, okay? So from 5, we get into 6, which is our left atrium. And then from 6, we have which valve is here? Remember the two names, atrioventricular valve, the left atrioventricular valve, going into the left ventricle, right? Left ventricle coming up towards the ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, brachiocephalic, um, subclavian, and coronary arteries, okay? So we got 6, 7, 8 coming up through the aorta, aortic system. So then that's going back to the rest of the body, or systemic circulation, right? It's going back to the rest of the body, and then that blood flow is gonna get filtered in those systemic capillaries. So if you think about, so we just talked about pulmonary and systemic, okay? So if you think about in systemic, that's when we're losing oxygen and gaining CO2, right? In the rest of the system, we're giving its oxygen, and we're gonna get that CO2, kind of giving the food and taking the waste. Coming back into coronary sinus, vena cavas, all the way to the right atrium again, 1, 2, 3, to the pulmonary capillaries, where we're getting rid of the waste and getting more food. Okay, that's how I see it. So this image is pretty cool. This whole pathway is pretty cool, and I would suggest you memorize this for sure, so you can get a good idea of that blood flow. So a lot of things that that you'll probably see through your career, or through your job and everything. There are going to be some big terms, or some problems, or some medications that are just going to give you like a vague kind of explanation what it does. But once you know that blood flow, once you know your different parts of your heart, then you're going to have a better understanding on the purpose of those and how they work, or how to fix it, or why we have these pacemakers, or all those kinds of stuff, right? So we'll get into that. All right. We also have what's called coronary circulation. I don't even know where I left in my textbook. I haven't even been going through it. Okay. Cardiac circulation. Okay. So we have the left coronary artery and we have the right coronary artery. So we have the anterior interventricular, so between the ventricles, artery, right? Artery is going away from it. And we have the posterior and the back interventricular artery as well. So we got the circumflex artery and marginal artery. So the circumflex is near the coronary sulcus and will distribute that oxygenated blood to the left ventricle and the left atrium. Then the marginal it will be beyond the sulcus and will run across the margin of the heart and transport that to the right ventricle. So it's just basically the left and the right side, kind of that coronary circulation. Okay, so as we can see here, these are anterior views. So we got the right coronary, right artery. So coming from that ascending aorta, kind of there's a little coming out of it, marginal branch coming through the bottom of it. The circumflex artery as well coming out of it. So again, talking about red, we're talking about oxygen-rich blood. It's coming out of the heart and those arteries, right, to different areas. And then we have, over here on the right side, we're going to have with oxygen poor, right, our vena cavas, our coronary sinus coming across a little bit. anterior cardiac and middle cardiac arteries, and the small cardiac right here as well. Right, so here's our coronary circulation. So here's our arteries, and here's our veins. Sorry, I think I messed up. Anterior cardiac veins coming here on the right. So those are the ones that are taking it back into the heart. Well, we have our coronary circulation and cardiac circulation coming out of the heart with our arteries here on the left. Okay. Now the cardiac conduction system. So that's basically the way our heart is going to pump or control its pumping to get those muscle contractions. So we got these autorhythmic cells. So these cells that already have a rhythm when they're gonna start contracting or not. That's basically our natural pacemakers, right? They're the ones that are gonna dictate the pace of when we have to pump, not to pump, pump, not to pump. Okay, and there are artificial pacemakers that are induced or introduced to people to kind of stimulate those nerve impulses or those action potentials, so the heart will pump in case our cells don't work or certain areas of our heart don't work, and that's what the pacemaker is going to help in. Okay, so kind of help remember it to pump or remind it to pump every certain amount of time, giving little shocks so it can pump it, right? Pacemaker fails, there's no pumping, there's no blood flow, right? It's pretty dangerous. And then that's gonna get into the cardiac conduction system. Okay. So basically, in that cardiac conduction system is kind of how that muscle contraction is gonna go, or the action potential. So we get, maybe this will be more when we talk about neurons, maybe we talk about the brain and the senses. But basically, you have these action potentials, and you should see it throughout. Maybe in the rest of in all our body, we have ions moving through, moving out, H plus, and all those things, calciums, potassium ions, and all those things going around. So basically, in our heart, we need to initiate an action potential. An action potential is get that kind of like a little, I call it chispa, kind of like a spark to get that heart muscle, send a signal to the muscle so it can contract and kick the blood out to where it needs to go, right? So it starts with the SA node or the sinoatrial node, and then we'll get into the atrioventricular node. So it's kind of the flow, and again, I'll show you an image right now. But it's pretty much kind of where the membrane is going to have these ions, this concentration of ions that are either more negative on the inside or the outside. And then by changing that concentration, it's going to stimulate a contraction or an action potential. And that's when we get our PQRS wave in an EKG or ECG that you've seen. The nervous system and certain hormones can alter those contractions, right? But the nervous system does not initiate it. Okay, so depending on the hormones that are being released, depending on all those chemicals in our brain that are being released, we can alter that, but it's not started by the nervous system or the hormones. Okay, it's these are these action potentials around the heart. Okay, so here it is. Here are the numbers. So basically, you start with the SA node. When you start there, it's going to have this little influx or this concentration of ions around it. Then it'll get to the AV node. So kind of think about the signal where it starts. I feel like that's what it'll be. The signal starts with the SA node, then to the AV node, and then if you follow it, it's going to be the atrioventricular bundle. So it's kind of between the atrium and the ventricle, the little bundle. And then it's gonna split into branches, right? So this is kind of like the interventricular septum right here in the middle. So it's gonna split into left and right branches, and it's gonna send that action potential, and then at the end it's gonna send those signals out. So this part of the muscle will contract and pump it out, right? So we talk about PQRST. So if you've seen these letters, you probably see this a lot. But the way to read it is basically polarization, depolarization. So you're talking about kind of like the SA node will kind of be in that little P area where it's kind of we got a little ion concentration. It's we call it polarized, so when it's kind of like even. But then when we got this flow of blood, right? We have a change in ionic concentration kind of in this area. And then you're gonna send those signals to the AV node to kind of promote this contraction of that muscle, right? So that's when so the blood flow. Think about the right here in the P. Think about the SA node, or think about the even ion concentration, and then send the signal kind of to this area, which is going to tell it, okay, we got to contract. So then the membrane, like I said, the membrane concentration right before that action potential, or the ionic concentration, is going to change. So the R, so going all the way up, will tell it, right, we gotta contract. So then you see this good action potential coming up. Um, Depolarization, right? So it changed it back from less to more, from more to less. It's kind of like ion concentration. And then we got repolarization on that little T area kind of coming around. So we're getting a little bit into it. I think next chapter we're going to get a little more in depth, um, but pretty much that's what it is. Just the signaling of the change in the ionic concentration to tell the muscles to contract, or sending a good action potential so that ventricle can contract, right? So this is kind of our atrium. We see in blue on the left and ventricle on the right. So kind of signal. This is how I see the signal coming through here, and then eventually it's like Q when it gets full, and then R is like it shoots it. RS. It's like, okay, the ion concentration changed, and now our ventricle is going to contract and send that blood flow. So by looking at this, you're able to see which area of this part can be damaged, or where it's wrong. Either we're not polarizing again, either we're not sending, we don't have the correct amount of that depolarization that's coming across. Either we're not even starting correctly, the ion concentration, that this is wrong. So depending on the area will depend on what, depending on the graph will depend on what area is kind of where the issue is going to be. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense. So we got membrane potential. It's kind of like where it starts. Potential. If you think a little about like potential energy, kinetic energy, if you ever took physics or remember chemistry or anything like that, but membrane potential. So it's kind of like the potential that it's gonna have of energy that it's gonna have to contract the muscle. Right. Polarization is just seeing there a good amount of even ions inside and outside. So around the areas of the membranes of the heart. Depolarization is when you have too much on the outside and the inside. Okay, it's time to contract. Repolarization is kind of like it shoots it again. It's like, all right, we got to get back to our polar again. So we got to get back to even. So we have minus pluses inside and outside. We're good. Now we have too many outside. Okay, got to shoot them out, and then we got to repolarize again to having a good inside and outside. That's when we get our P wave, QRS wave, and T wave. And the action potential, or that impulse, is when it's going to cause that contraction. Whew. Okay, feel free to take a break whenever you want. We're almost done. I think we have a couple of slides left, but okay. The cardiac cycle, or a heartbeat. So a single cardiac cycle is going to be all those events in one heartbeat. So when we talk about cardiac cycle, we're talking about one heartbeat, right? Normally the atria contract while the ventricles relax, and vice versa. Remember, we saw in those valves, we saw how two of them were going to open, two of them are going to close. Same thing, the atrium are going to release while the ventricle is relaxing, and then the ventricle is going to pump while the atrium is kind of relaxing. Okay, so we have systole and diastole, right? You heard of this? We're talking about our blood pressure, systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So pretty much here's our cardiac cycle, right? Relaxation period, that would be our diastolic pressure that we're gonna have. So you want a good relaxation period, right? You got a good amount of that pressure. So you want a nice pressure during that relaxation period, okay? And then when we have this action potential, membranes, depolarization, repolarization, and all that, we have the atrium kind of contracting, and then the ventricle contracting, and that's our systole contraction. So that's why it's higher, systolic and diastolic, right? Systolic is higher because you're going to have this big contraction in the atrium and the ventricles, right? And the diastolic, you're going to have this relaxation kind of period. So it's basically how you measure that blood pressure, how much blood is actually going to be during those events that are going to happen throughout the heart. Okay. We're talking about heart sounds, which you're going to have a lot, and you're going to get your stethoscopes a lot. Auscultation is pretty much the hearing of the heart. So first sound is lub, second sound is the dup. Okay, and let me see where I left here in our in our book. So we got our heart murmurs or our sounds. So the S1, so the first one is going to be a little louder than the second one. It's pretty much that sound that you hear is pretty much after the valves kind of like open or close, right? So once it's going to pump that sound like boom, 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 boom. It's like opening and closing. Okay. The second one is shorter. It's going to be that dup, or they call it dup, lub dup, lub dup. Closure of those SL valves at the beginning of ventricular relaxation, right? So we're talking about when you're gonna the S1 is gonna be where our ventricles are gonna pump the blood out, boom, 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 boom. So it's louder, right? It makes sense. It's louder when we're pumping all the blood out. And also think about the muscle, the amount of muscle in the ventricles, right? It's a lot more than those atriums. The second one is kind of where our atrium pumps it in. Ventricle out, atrium in. Ventricle out, atrium in. Okay. So the sounds are best heard over the chest at areas a little away from that location because you're gonna have a little echo kind of through the rest of the arteries or the veins or whatever's around it. Okay, there's actually two more, but we really can't hear them enough. But it's pretty much when we get that heart sound where you're trying to listen to someone's heartbeat, which I can feel it right now. That's good. That means I'm pumping. That means I'm alive. Okay. So here's a little image. So here's like a picture kind of where the valves kind of go. And then in red is kind of where the sounds are heard the loudest. So not necessarily in the valve itself. So that's why like they move it around, kind of around the heart. You already know in different areas. So you're thinking, this makes sense, right? Doesn't this sound like the best area to hear it? You're gonna have this muscle contraction down here, right? Muscle's gonna contract. This one's gonna close or open up. It's gonna shoot it out, right? So you have certain areas where it's gonna hear the loudest. All right. I think we're almost done. I'm pretty sure. I feel like it's going a little long. Oh yeah, we're pretty much done. Okay. So it's important we exercise. It's important we increase our cardiovascular fitness. We have a good fitness of our hearts. We exercise. We get our heart pumping. Kind of clean it out. Let good blood flow going. The more blood flows, the more we're cleaning out our arteries, our veins. The more we're cleaning our blood as well. Prolonged training increases maximal cardiac output. It's actually a pretty cool story. I trained. Well, my dad worked with this professional boxer, and then we trained a lot. I trained during high school a little bit with him, and we went to like Mexico City to the mountains, and there was a lot of athletes that go to the Olympics and all that over there. And there was a study that they made. Some scientists went over there and they made a study in which those like marathon runners and Olympic athletes have a lower heart rate because their lungs they worked out their lungs more and they worked out their heart a little more. So it was they had like a how can I explain this? Like I'm not 100% sure exactly what happened back then, but I just remember knowing that they were able to accumulate more blood and more oxygen in their lungs, um, that it looked like they had some problems, some breathing problems, but no, they were able to just contract more and relax more because they worked it out so much. Think about it, it's a muscle. Like you're exercising the muscle. They work it out so much that they're able to kind of like hold more and push out more and hold more and push out more, which was pretty cool. So, anyways, I just wanted to say that. It just came out on top of my head. It wasn't planned. We have the stroke volume, or how much blood is actually coming through. Um, Physiological and pathological cardiomegaly. So just it can be like different um, issues that can occur. And then exercise will help. Reduce blood pressure, anxiety, depression. Will control weight. Increase the ability to dissolve blood clots. So even if we have unhealthy eating or we eat unhealthy food, just by working out and pumping that blood is able to clean those clots as well. So kind of keep it clean, keep your body clean, take care of your body. And in order for us to recommend it to other people, we got to do it ourselves first, right? We got to set the example. So yeah. And the last one, clinical connection on kind of on this, or like kind of wrapping everything together. Coronary artery disease, or CAD. So it's one of the biggest causes of death. I was reading some stats. I found some stats in here. Um, where's it at? I think I passed it. Yes. So it affects about 7 million people annually, responsible for nearly 3/4 of a million deaths in the US every year. The leading cause of death for both men and women. So coronary artery disease. So it's pretty crazy. It's pretty scary. So it's just how can we prevent that, or what are risk factors? So you can get, maybe if it's interesting to you, you can read a little more in the book. It talks a little bit about risk factors, about these plaques that are accumulated throughout the vessels, how to diagnose it and how to treat it. But basically, um, if you think about a hose that's passing water, when you kind of like squeeze an area of the hose, you increase that pressure, right? If you put, I don't know if anyone's done it, but like when you don't have like that nozzle at the end where like you can spray it, you take it out, you put like your thumb, right, and it covers like half of the hose, and like it like spreads out more or further away, right? So you kind of like clogging a certain area. That's increasing the pressure. So basically, when on this image, you're going to see on the left a normal artery, on the right an obstructed artery, and that's an atherosclerotic plaque. So these plaques that are accumulating in those arteries, all right. So what's going to happen? This area, or the diameter for the water to flow, is going to be increased. It's kind of like in the hose. You're cutting like half of where the water can flow, so the water is going to squeeze through the rest, and it's going to push out completely. So it increases your blood pressure. So that's why it's super, super, super important. We're working out, we're exercising, we're eating healthy, because we want to clean those arteries. We don't want that blood pressure to increase, go up, and clog all these arteries in there with just fats and things that aren't soluble in water. And we have to get into then more invasive techniques and get into surgeries and things like that, which is what we don't want. So here's another little example. You can see here on the left, there's a little obstruction. Um, okay, so here's a little obstruction. So what they're gonna do is they're gonna insert what they call a little balloon catheter. It's gonna come in. They'll inflate it. It'll kind of push all of that plaque kind of more into the walls, kind of narrow it down, um, and then they'll take it out. And you see how at first there's like a narrower passageway for the blood, but then when you push it up, kind of push it into it, you have a better passage of blood. Now this isn't super helpful. If you can prevent it, well, obviously that's the best thing to do. But eventually, the us going in there and kind of pumping that and affecting that artery, it's going to weaken the artery. So eventually, it's not going to really going to work. There's sometimes where they have to leave a catheter or put a little tube that's going to serve kind of like as a skeleton on the inside of that artery to allow the blood flow to keep moving and moving and moving. So we can prevent all of this. We should. Working out, and starting with me. I'm actually going to work out right now after doing this. But yep, that's it. Okay, so I'll see you in class, and I'll also upload the next video, which will be chapter 14.